Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a story that's just packed with contradictions. We're talking about a man who was seen by some as a messiah and by others as a cult leader. A man who was actually imprisoned by both communists and capitalists. This is the story of Reverend Sun Myung Moon.
So, who was this guy? The source material lays out this incredible journey, all the way from a small Korean village under occupation to the world stage. But to really understand the movement, we have to start with the man at the center of it all.
All right, so the whole story really kicks off right here, with this one moment that defines everything else. According to the source, this wasn't just some personal spiritual thing. This was a direct order, a commission from Jesus Christ himself, to finish the mission that was started on Earth 2,000 years ago. I mean, that's a monumental claim, and it's one that would shape his entire destiny.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the man, you have to get a feel for the world he was born into. Let's rewind the clock and go back to the beginning, to a farm in Korea, a country struggling under colonial rule, and see what created this young visionary.
So picture this. He's born into a farming family, and his country, Korea, is under Japanese occupation. He's seeing immense suffering all around him, every single day. And the source material says this really got to him. He started asking these big questions like, why is the world so broken? And why aren't religions doing anything to fix it? That search for answers really became the driving force of his youth.
And then, everything changes. The biography points to this one specific moment. It's Easter morning, 1935. He's just 15 years old, out praying on a mountainside, and bam, he has a vision that completely flips his life upside down.
So in this vision, he says Jesus Christ shows up. And he's not just there for a chat. He asks him to take on this massive, almost unbelievable job. Finish the work of building God's kingdom right here on earth. The biography says he really wrestled with this, but in the end, he said yes, knowing it was going to be an incredibly tough road.
Now, you might think accepting a mission from God would smooth things over for you, right? Well, not in this case. In fact, it was like lighting a fuse that started a lifetime of persecution from, well, just about everyone.
Yeah, the source paints a picture of just non-stop opposition. And we're not talking about a one-off problem or a single enemy. This was a constant battle against some of the most powerful forces on the planet, as you're about to see.
Okay, this slide right here, this really puts it all in perspective. 6 times. He was thrown in prison 6 different times. And just look at the governments that did it. Imperial Japan, Communist North Korea, Democratic South Korea, and even the United States. I mean, these are regimes that couldn't agree on anything, but they all seem to see him as a threat.
But by far his most brutal, just horrific experience was in North Korea. The biography says he was sent to the Hungnam concentration camp, a place where, get this, most people didn't even last 6 months. He survived there for almost 3 years, and in a crazy twist of fate, UN troops liberated the camp just hours before he was set to be executed.
So, after literally being pulled from the jaws of death, you'd think he'd want to lay low, right? Nope. As a refugee in a country torn apart by war, he started from absolute zero and began building a global movement right there in the rubble. And when we say humble beginnings, we are not kidding. His very first church was literally a shack built out of mud and old, discarded cardboard boxes from the army. Can you imagine? And it was from that hut that he made this totally audacious claim that his message would one day cover the entire globe.
And check out this timeline. It shows just how fast that idea exploded. He officially founds the church in '54. Just a few years later, he's already sending missionaries out. And by 1975, just over 20 years later, they have a presence in 120 countries. That is just staggering growth. Soon, you just couldn't deny the scale of his influence. I mean, look at this. At the absolute peak of the Cold War, he gets over 1 million people together in Seoul. And this wasn't just a prayer meeting. This was a massive public stand against communism, which he saw as this huge atheistic barrier to building God's kingdom.
So in 1971, he sets his sights on America. He saw the U.S. as playing a key role in God's plan, but his arrival was, well, it was a big deal. It led to these huge rallies, but also some major controversy. He starts holding these huge speaking events all over the country. It all builds up to this massive rally right at the Washington Monument on America's 200th birthday, no less. Something like 300,000 people showed up to hear what he had to say.
But, when you get that influential, you attract a lot of attention.
And after he publicly called for Americans to forgive President Nixon during the Watergate scandal, the political and media scrutiny just went through the roof. It all led to a federal indictment for tax evasion. Now, the government's whole case was about a pretty small amount of money in a bank account under his name. But his supporters were saying, hold on, this is how it's done. It's common for religious leaders to hold church funds in trusts like this.
And it's wild because he got support from all these mainline Christian leaders and civil liberties groups. They were all worried this was a threat to religious freedom. But he was convicted anyway. The whole thing was so controversial that a U.S. Senate subcommittee actually looked into it and came out with this blistering report, basically saying that injustice rather than justice has been served.
Okay, so after he gets out of prison in the US, his focus starts to shift. He becomes more and more involved in global reconciliation and trying to build peace, often by going right into the world's biggest hotspots.
And this is what's truly mind-boggling. He was willing to sit down and talk with his fiercest enemies. I mean, this is a guy who spent his whole life fighting communism, and there he is, meeting with the Soviet President Gorbachev in Moscow. And then, and this is the craziest part, he goes to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Il-sung. That's the dictator whose government sentenced him to die in a labor camp years before. Just wow.
But for him, peace wasn't just about politicians shaking hands. It was about rebuilding society from the family up. He started the Family Federation, based on the idea that strong, God-centered families are the real foundation for a peaceful world. He also came up with this idea for a global council of religious and spiritual leaders to work with the UN to bring that spiritual element into solving conflicts.
So, after all that, what do we make of this guy? An evangelist, an entrepreneur, a peacemaker? The source material presents this picture of a man with almost superhuman endurance who survived unimaginable persecution to build a worldwide movement. And yet, he's still one of the most controversial figures of last century. So the question is, was he a divinely guided peacemaker who was beyond politics? Or was he a brilliant manipulator who built an empire? It seems the legacy of Sun Myung Moon is just as complicated and debated as the man himself.